There is a question that followed me for most of my life, a question I asked God over and over again, sometimes in anger, sometimes in tears, sometimes in complete silence. Why? Why would a loving God allow something so painful, so confusing, so unfair to happen? For 60 years, I did not receive an answer, or at least I believed I hadn't. But something strange happens when you reach 82 years old. Your life begins to look different. You begin to see patterns you couldn't see when you were young. Moments that once felt meaningless suddenly begin to connect. And pain, the pain that once seemed unbearable, starts revealing something deeper. Last winter, sitting alone in a quiet room with nothing but a Bible and my thoughts, I finally understood. I understood why God allowed the hardest pain of my life. And when the realization came, I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt something else: peace. When I was a young man, my faith was simple, very simple. I believed God rewarded the good and corrected the bad. If you prayed, things would work out. If you trusted Him, life would go smoothly. At least, that's what I thought. I grew up in a church where people sang loudly and prayed passionately. My mother used to say something to me every Sunday morning. She would look at me and say, "God is always working, even when you cannot see it." I believed her. But belief is easy when life is kind. Faith is easy when everything is going well. The real test of faith is what happens when life breaks your heart. I was 27 years old when my life changed. 27. Young enough to believe I understood the world. Old enough to think I understood God. At that time, I had a small family, a loving wife, a beautiful little daughter who followed me everywhere. She had the brightest laugh you could imagine. Sometimes she would sit on my shoulders after church and pretend she was taller than everyone else. Those were the happiest years of my life. And then one afternoon, everything changed. My daughter became sick. At first, it seemed like something small, just a fever. Doctors told us not to worry, but the fever didn't go away. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into hospital visits. And eventually, the doctors told us something no parent ever wants to hear. There was nothing they could do. I remember standing in a hospital hallway staring at the floor. My mind couldn't accept what they had just said. I kept asking the same question in my heart. God, why? Why her? Why my child? Why would you allow this? For months I prayed. I prayed harder than I had ever prayed before. I begged God to heal her. I promised Him anything. But heaven was silent. And one night, my daughter passed away. That moment broke something inside me. Not just my heart, my faith. For years after that, I struggled. I still went to church. I still read my Bible. But something had changed. Every time someone said, "God has a plan," I felt anger rising inside me. Because the pain felt meaningless, cruel, unnecessary. I kept asking the same question again and again. Why would God allow something like this? But no answer came. Life moved forward the way it always does. Years passed. My wife and I grew older. We had more children. Grandchildren eventually filled our house with laughter again. But that question never disappeared. It stayed with me quietly, like a shadow. And sometimes late at night I would sit alone and think about my daughter. I would remember her laugh, her tiny footsteps running through the house, and I would whisper the same question: why? Last winter something happened. Something very simple, but powerful. I was reading the story of Joseph in the Bible. You know the story. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, imprisoned. For years, his life seemed full of suffering that made no sense. But eventually, Joseph said something remarkable. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. And suddenly something inside me shifted. For the first time in 60 years, I saw my pain differently. You see, after my daughter died, something happened to my heart. I began to notice people's suffering in a way I never had before. I became more compassionate, more patient, more aware of how fragile life really is. And because of that pain, I spent decades helping families who were grieving, sitting beside hospital beds, praying with people who had lost children, comforting strangers in their darkest moments. And suddenly I realized something. If I had never experienced that loss, I would have never been able to help those people. Pain has a strange way of shaping a person. It can make you bitter, or it can make you compassionate. Looking back over 82 years, I finally understood something I wish I had realized sooner. God was not punishing me. He was shaping me. The pain that once felt meaningless became the very thing that allowed me to comfort others. If you are listening to this right now, and you are carrying pain in your heart, please hear this. You may not understand your suffering today. You may not see the reason. But God's work in our lives often takes years, even decades, to reveal itself. And one day, perhaps much later, you may look back over your life the way I did, and you might finally understand why God allowed your hardest pain. I waited 82 years to understand, but when I finally did, I realized something beautiful. God had been working the entire time, even when I couldn't see it. And that was the answer to the question I carried for most of my life.